This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Happy snow day. It is a wonderful snow day here in Northwest Georgia, and I'm joined by two elders from Northwest Georgia Presbytery here as I sit on in Tennessee Valley Presbytery, but still in the Free State of Georgia. Welcome, Ruling Elder Matt Lee and Teaching Elder Job Dalomba, both from Christ Covenant Church in Woodstock. Thanks for giving up your time this day.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us, Ryan.
Well, it is my privilege. So as we're at a snow day. It's a new year, and so I thought it might be fun, helpful, maybe even edifying to think about where the PCA has been over the last 4 or 5 years, starting about 2018 until today, 7 years later, I guess, in 2025. And we've had a number of battles that have been fought, hard, difficult, awkward, uncomfortable discussions, debates at General Assembly, and then, of course, online by podcasts and blogs. And yet, as we look at this year's General Assembly coming up here in Tennessee Valley Presbytery in Chattanooga, about 25 minutes from where I'm sitting, I think there are 8 overtures up, and they are all very anodyne. Now that is not to say they're not significant and we shouldn't think about them, but it's perfecting our procedure and perfecting our polity. So as we've emphasized the peace of the church, brothers, I think what we're seeing, or as we have emphasized the purity of the church, I think what we're seeing is greater peace in the PCA. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, it's 6 overtures actually, Ryan. I just pulled
6.
the page up.
Well, I was told there would be
even
no
more peace and unity than you were saying there with 8. Down from 35 last year. Of course, we still have a few months to go before General Assembly, but
yes. Well, we should invite Scott Edberg on to tell us when these overtures were submitted and where we are by comparison to the last several years. But the big issue, Job, that has really captured so much of the attention of the PCA over the last 6.5, 7 years was revoice. Mm-hmm. And we have, by and large, rejected the revoice downgrade, as I have called it. We've strengthened our Constitution regarding character requirements for officers. We've seen the departure of one congregation in St. Louis and 2 or 3 teaching elders in St. Louis. But I don't think the danger is past. Right? That congregation, because the Presbytery and the General Assembly failed to deal directly with the specific errors that were being practiced by that congregation and taught by that teaching elder, that congregation and teaching elder, they're causing trouble in a new denomination as they try to get in. But even as we think about the peace that we have, I want to play a clip from a speech that Greg Johnson gave in 2019, I think it was, at General Assembly, and get your feedback on it.
Okay.
And it's a well-known, remembered speech, but I want to reflect on what he said in 2019, and then remember that it was 3 more years that he was given cover and protection within the PCA before he finally left on his own accord. So this is just a few snippets of that speech from 2019.
Fathers and brothers, teaching elder Greg Johnson from Missouri Presbytery. By God's grace, he pursued me, and in college I became a Christian and trusted Jesus. I was baptized in a PCA church at age 20, and the next year enrolled at Covenant Seminary, not because I had any interest in going into ministry, that took another decade, but because I wanted to catch up and make up for lost time. And I had read every single book that R.C. Sproul had written and purchased all of his VHS audio tapes and memorized them all. And I was still hungry. At this point, I'm 46 years old and still same-sex attracted. My orientation has not changed, and for those who are exclusively same-sex attracted, who are men, we don't know for certain of even, I've talked to every head of every ministry and can't find a single instance of same-sex attraction going away. And so where that leaves me at age 46 is I'm a 46-year-old virgin who has never so much as held hands. I've never had a romantic embrace. I have never hugged romantically. I have had a history of struggle with pornography, of which I am now 15 years sober. I am mortifying my flesh every single day, and yet that has a cost. Jesus has washed me, and yet I'm in the fight for my life every single day, and I don't regret that one bit. But the cost is this. The cost is that there are no family photographs on my mantle because I have no family. The cost is I know what it's like to sit alone at home in my apartment on Christmas Day because I have no family. The cost is that someday I will have to be buried, not cremated, because there will be no one to receive my ashes, because my line ends with me. And I don't regret that. I accept that as a calling to suffer for the sake of Jesus, who says that those who give up fathers and mothers and husbands, wives and children and brothers and sisters for my sake will receive 100 times more. And I love Jesus, and I want to serve him, and I'm willing to suffer for him because it's that beautiful. And yet, friends, when I read Article 7 of the Nashville Statement, it hurts, because Article 7 says that it is a sin to adopt a homosexual self-conception. And we don't do that for any other people group. We don't tell alcoholics it's a sin to conceive of yourself as an alcoholic because drunkenness is a sin. It's the beginning of learning to manage your alcoholism in obedience to Christ so it doesn't define you. We don't tell paraplegics that they should conceive of themselves as able-bodied because that's God's ideal. We wouldn't tell an infertile woman that she needs to conceive of herself as fertile and she's unbelieving to conceive of herself as infertile, because that's not God's design. Friends, I'm fallen, I'm broken, and Jesus has washed me and saved me. And my prayer is that you would consider the damage that will be done to people like me when Article 7 says that it's a sin to acknowledge our brokenness and our shame and the suffering and sorrow that goes with that. My prayer is that we will instead do the hard work of coming up with something biblically nuanced, theologically sophisticated, missionally sensitive, and pastorally sensitive, so that people like me don't have to go through all of the suffering I had, because their pastors will be well equipped to love people who are broken and same-sex attracted and waiting for glory. Thank you, brothers.
But here's Article 7. We deny that adopting a homosexual or transgender self-conception is consistent with God's holy purposes in creation and redemption. So just to reflect on where we have been, in 2019, a speech like that was made on the floor of General Assembly, and then for 3 years, people defended Greg Johnson as articulating just another variation of Orthodox Reformed teaching, until he finally left. You saw in the video there, Scott Sauls right behind him, there for moral support, and Scott Sauls is also gone. So have we turned a corner here, do you think? Do you think a speech like that, if it were made in 2025, would get applause at the General Assembly?
Well, it's a big room, and so I do think that you could always have something. I don't remember. That was before I was ordained, Ryan, so I don't exactly remember. It was the
Well,
year
you were ordained a Baptist before you came
That's
into
true. I think I might still be ordained a Baptist. I don't know. I'd have to check. But I didn't renounce it, now that I think about it. I didn't formally renounce it. Anyway, I don't remember how loud the applause was, though. So I remember the speech and seen it since, of course. But I would say this. I don't sense that speech would be as well received. And I think that some of it is because there are things that he said that I think in hindsight we've kind of we've understood better. For example, when he says you shouldn't say to a paraplegic or an infertile person, the comment he made there, I think most people in my census would know that's not the same thing. It's not in the same category. So that's where it was flawed in that sense. And there, I want to say again, there were things that Greg said that I'm incredibly sympathetic to. There are things that he said that I'm thankful for to hear him confess about himself, his forgiveness of sins, and his clinging to Christ. And I am grateful that he's pursues holiness in those ways. But the issue was of adopting self-conceptions and speaking of it as if it's just the way it is. We've learned as well, I don't think anyone would say you can't talk to other heads of ministries or whatever and find anyone that basically stops being same-sex attracted. We've had, didn't a man, a ruling elder, come on this podcast and tell a story about that? wasn't one of the founders of Revoice. Hasn't he married a woman? I think pretty sure these things happen. And so you can sit there and say that that's one or two people, but that's one or two people within the orbit of the conversation. And I think that's telling. I don't think that speech in that way would be made. I think the part about consideration, sympathy, and such would still be made. And I think it's going to be made in most controversial speeches. That's always going to be something. But no, I think the content of where the division was, I think is not there. And I would love, I asked this sincerely. He said, you don't know the damage you're being done. We've had enough time. Like, I would love to hear a response to that and say, is there evidence to that? Maybe that I'm open. Tell me if there's evidence that the damage that he said was going to be done was done. And I will hear in past Memorial Press. I'm not even saying a comment on that, but let's take them out of the equation. What else has been done? Because the speech was made well beyond damage to him, but to people like him. So what is it? We've had enough time to know.
Yeah, like Job, I was not. I think I was ordained as a ruling elder in the PCA at this point, but I was not all that active beyond our local session. And I think probably a lot of particularly ruling elders are in a similar category with me, where this broader conversation kind of awakened a lot of ruling elders to be more cognizant of the issues that were taking place at a national scale, rather than just being involved locally with your particular congregation, or even regionally with your presbytery. But I think even as I served as a ruling elder in my congregation, I wasn't, I would say the importance of being involved in a connectional body was not really that impressed upon me. And so I think I learned a lot in this way about getting involved at both the presbytery level and the General Assembly level. So I think there's been some good, just in terms of really intense theological debate that took place over an issue like this, and that we should always be open to, in a decent and orderly way, having those conversations. Job made a good point about distinguishing between a same-sex attracted identity and an infertile or paraplegic identity, and I think that's an important point that was made as we kind of progressed in this theological discussion. But I think another one was understanding the difference between the qualifications for an officer in the PCA versus just how we would welcome a visitor or even a member. That there's a degree of sanctification and calling in life that we expect of perhaps even more so a teaching elder than a ruling elder or deacon. I don't know if I should say something like that, but that we would expect a little bit more, in accordance with, was it Larger Catechism 156? I can't say off the top of my head now, about more being expected of those who have more training, who have a greater eminence, whether of years or education or standing, that there's more expected of them in terms of the godliness of the life that they lead. And that's, I think, trickled down to, as you mentioned, the overture that was ultimately passed and amended our BCO to say that we need to examine candidates for ministry in this way. So I think that's been very fruitful. I think we've also learned a lot more about the man, Greg Johnson himself. As he said these things in the years since he's left the PCA, I think he's become more vocal about not only affirming a same-sex attracted identity, but also affirming in maybe not for himself, but in others, and actively practicing lifestyle as well. So I think that's also been very revealing in terms of who Greg Johnson was and also where this debate was headed.
I think Matt's point, if I could follow up real quick, Ryan, Matt's point about the godliness and expectation of officers in the church has certainly been at the forefront. But I think one way it's bore fruit is that no matter where you fall on this, I don't hear a whole lot about the sanctification and the godliness and the expectation of character qualifications for officers, I hear that generally talked about more, and it's not really in relation to revoice, or that but it did come out of that in some ways. In other words, I think there may have been a fear from some that, okay, we're going to not, there was those who did not want to prove revoice. They wanted guys like Greg Johnson to be either disciplined, lead the PCA. We didn't want to tolerate same-sex attraction as an identity, but to compromise with you, we will we'll say that we need to work on godliness. I think there was a fear that was going to happen, and I think there's probably good reason to think that things like that could be just words and not actually followed through on and thought. But I would say that in my perception, it actually is discussed more, and it's out there. People think about it, people discuss it, and it has taken root in a good way across the PCA. The qualifications of an officer and his character are very important, and I think that while we can look at it and say it may have been amped up post revoice or during that, that is something good that came out of it.
Is it my mic that's buzzing?
It was, but it isn't anymore, I think, maybe.
It's monitoring your heart rate for how irritated you are.
Yeah, Joe,
Ryan, you raised the question as to whether or not a speech like this would get applause in 2025. And I think, first of all, we should note that it's out of order to applaud any speech, right, on the floor of General Assembly. I don't think so. Yeah, either way, right? We're not supposed to react. But I think there's been a great deal of unity achieved on this issue, and it's been achieved over the course of a lot of debate and a lot of clarifying conversation about this issue that has helped the PCA as a whole understand this issue much more deeply. And I think maybe that's all I was going to say. Let me switch my mic here.
Oh, thanks. So, there was a lot of confusion in 2019. I don't know how many elders in the PCA, how many teaching elders in the PCA would have known what concupiscence is in 2019 versus even 2020. But one of the issues that I think is still ongoing is the difference between celibacy and chastity. That, before we started recording, we were discussing the Sound of Music and the deep influence of the Romanist Church in that movie. And celibacy is something that comes out of the Roman Catholic Church, whereas chastity is a biblical concept of that applies to single and married people alike, but in different ways. And it seemed like in 2019, a lot of elders, not understanding that issue, thought as long as there's celibacy by the sodomites, that's enough. Whereas I think the PCA now, at least in the main, the Overton window, if we could put it that way, has better understood that what is required of all Christians is chastity. And so if going around talking about our predilections for this, that, or the other is not fit for ministry. Have you noticed that distinction coming out in exams, that guys are refining their language to speak not just about celibacy but chastity?
I haven't paid attention to that degree, Ron. I admit, I don't recall that distinction coming up, but I do think that the question comes up in views exams on the floor, and it seems clear that the way we're talking, the way you're distinguishing between celibacy and chastity, that there is a certain there's usually an expression of that to one degree or another. It's not those terms per se. I don't recall being used.
Yeah, it's been a couple of years since I've been involved. It's been a couple of years since I've been involved in an exam like that, but I do remember a couple of years ago that those questions would be brought up more. So, yeah,
and the expectations for teaching elders are higher, which they should be, because we have these low expectations. Because by and large, vast majority of us, were ignorant on this issue, and we've refined. We've become more pure and maybe even more peaceful as a result of this. Well, I kind of want to change gears, unless there's anything else to say about Revoice and St. Louis theology.
Just one last thing in terms of the comment that you made about whether or not the danger has passed. I can't remember if it was a personal statement that Greg Johnson released or if it was from Memorial Press after they departed the PCA, but something along the lines of, continuing to pray for people within the PCA who are sympathetic to their views, kind of indicated that, the issue does not completely go away with Greg Johnson, although I think we have, especially if we trace the votes on the overtures that sought to address this issue, much more unity was achieved with the one that was ultimately passed. So I think there is a sense of much more unity among the body, but there was also kind of that admission that there are still others within the PCA that are sympathetic to Greg Johnson's views on this issue.
Yeah, I do remember that in the letter, and I only remember one of Greg Johnson's supporters who actually publicly came out in writing and said, I should have been more serious, more vocal in correcting him or something like that. And he's been on this podcast. It was David Cassidy who very humbly, very clearly said, we were wrong. We let him go too far afield. And there seems to be some regret that, maybe if guys in 2019 had pulled him aside and said, Craig, what you're saying is a Roman Catholic view. And of course he's got a PhD from a Romish university. So maybe that's where, it's hard to distinguish the biblical views from Roman Catholic views. But
if you take that example that David Cassidy said on here, that he said there was some regret and some reflection that he or others had needed to do more, and yet here you are saying there's a lot of us who realize that we need to do more. Isn't that contributing to peace and some purity? That there may not be total agreement on certain things, but look at what's come out of that. Is like there's a lot of people in a lot of places saying we need to do more about character requirements, and we need to do more to look at self-identification as a sin. And we're understanding that we've not done these two, what started out as potentially two different places. There's a lot of agreement across the board about those two. And that seems to be a good thing. I don't see how it's a bad thing. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it is certainly progress.
Yeah. The good kind.
Yes. Good progress.
Yeah. Well, thanks. So as we move on to deal with feminism, feminism is around us. Although feminism may be on the decline as men enter women's sports, who knows what it means to be a feminist if men can compete? But I want to reflect on an overture that failed in 2018. So Savannah River Presbytery, another one of our great Georgia presbyteries. They're up in the top 10 presbyteries in the PCA for sure. And also the presbytery, thanks to your research, Matt, that we know has the largest percentage with evening worship in terms of those congregations. But what they asked the General Assembly to do in 2018 was simply tell the presbyteries to inquire about the unordained diaconate. That you got a number of churches that have either no diaconate or they don't ordain their deacons, and to find out why is that, and to try to maybe very mildly suggest that perhaps if it's convenient, you might think about the possibility of someday having a diaconate. So that very mild overture failed in 2018. And now, 6 years later, we're in a totally different place, aren't we? With what was item 1 last year, that you can't have an unordained diaconate. If you have an unordained diaconate, you don't have a diaconate. that you can't give the title of deacon, pastor, or elder to any person who is not ordained. Joe, I think you were on the episode that we did where we looked at some of what was going on, and why this overture was necessary. So, we had, one church in Atlanta with deacons, and you see there a picture of a number of their deacons. But last night, I went and looked up that same church, and they've changed their website. They don't list these people as deacons anymore. So that's progress.
Definitely is. I think that was our Presbyterian's overture, wasn't it?
I think it may. Yes, you had to go and you took the baton from Savannah and Northwest Georgia, took it over the finish line.
Yeah, it went well. I'm sorry, I don't remember what your question was.
But I think you were on this podcast, and this church in particular has they've changed their website, their layout. I'm going to try to pull it up so you can see what it looks like now. Let's see. Production team claimed about a snow day or something, but whatever that is. So they're now it's the diaconal ministry team, undefined, but nonetheless, they're pretty clear that these are not, or at least they're not claiming that they're deacons. That's a big change.
It shows a response to the overture.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to comment on if it's satisfactory or not. I'm looking at it through your screen share. I'm interested in all those tabs you have open, by the way. I don't like all that. But it does tell me that if that's what they're doing, that's good. They recognize it, and I think that was part of one of the requests is like, we're not even really. Obviously, if we don't want to see the title used for unordained people, it's most likely those who voted in favor of that don't really believe in ordaining female deacons, or probably the vast majority do. But that wasn't really the point. The point was, this is how we practice things, and we want to make that clear, and we don't want to practice in an incorrect way, especially that violates what we've agreed to do in our church constitution. So this is good progress, because there is an allowance for
diaconal assistance.
I'm sorry, I was going blank on the term. And so, would I do it this way? No, I would not. I would probably make it clear who are the deacons and who are the assistants. Okay, but I accept, at least by looking at it, like, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's kind of tricky about this issue is there is a way by the book not to have a diaconate, right? Our Book of Church Order says that if you do not have a diaconate, then the duties of the diaconate fall to the session. Yeah. And so there is a way, I think, keeping with the letter of the law, but from my perspective, not keeping with the spirit of the law, for a church in good standing in the PCA to have a session without a diaconate. And I think there's been some conversation in these years about why the diaconate is a gift. These officers are gifts that Christ gives to the church, and we should recognize and be thankful for that gift. And I think the trendy thing seems to be to have, in lieu of a diaconate, some sort of a mercy team, where you can have people serving in what seems to be analogical to diaconal functions in terms of what Scripture outlines, to have a mercy team with unordained men and women serving as mercy team members. Again, to me, that doesn't seem to be in the spirit of our polity and in the spirit of our understanding of what the office of deacon is and what the diaconate is. But as I said, the tricky thing about this issue is that it's possible to have some sort of arrangement like that while still technically being in keeping with our polity.
I think, Matt, that's a really good point about the understanding of the offices, and maybe particularly the office of deacon and its importance. and it's being given to us by Christ. It's something he desires for his church and wants in his church. That is, I've noticed that and more talk about that discussion. So I didn't come into the PCA even as a member until 2018, which, Ryan, as you've noted in the past, is exactly the time everything started turning. It's just
that was when the shift happened.
But, hey,
so
but I wasn't ordained until 2020.
Don't leave.
Well, we're buying the OPC and the ARP. So
are we buying them, or are we just absorbing them and then making them pay us?
A little bit of both, probably.
I think the OPC might insist that they absorb us, but
yeah, that's a real inside joke. And the timing of all this being released is hilarious to consider when all that happened. But no, so I didn't come in and ordain until 2020. So I can't. I'm hesitant to say what I'm about to say, but I think this is still true. It was likely, and seems to be in hearing people talk, that a lot of things were just not even necessarily bad, but kind of assumed in the PCA. We have deacons, and deacons are this or that, and maybe sometimes when you don't think about things, you realize all of a sudden its importance, and you have to defend it, and maybe it's something you have to think about afresh, and it gives you appreciation for it. I can say that when I teach officer training, there's a new level of appreciation for each office, and it comes out. And I think that you have to, when you start looking at that, that's helpful to you. Imagine that happening across, an entire church body like ours is fairly large by Presbyterian standards. There's a good renewed interest there, and I think that's helpful. So a lot of these things do overlap. We look at one thing about qualifications, but then it begs the question, why are the qualifications so important? Because of the offices. Well, why are the offices important? Because Christ gives them to us, and he gives men to fit to be in there, and he has expectations for that, and he expects these offices to do certain things and fills us with the spirit that it would happen. There's a lot of excitement that comes to just reconsidering things we knew that we didn't deny or put aside, but maybe in our minds we just haven't had a battle over it. So now all of a sudden we get one, and it becomes a renewed interest. And diaconal care seems to be something that's talked about with a fresh energy.
The offices are of the gifts that Christ has given to the church, and why would you want fewer gifts? I mean, it's not like you have to pay taxes on them. But if you're right,
sufficient.
What's that?
They're sufficient too. It's elders and deacons, and we need, or maybe it's other ways. Say, why would you want less? But it's like, that's not enough. We need another one. And I think we've kind of realized, we have sufficiency in these things.
Let me ask you this. As a pastor of a small church, it is such a blessing to me to be able to say, when people will ask me this or that, and say, that's a deacon matter. I cannot say yes or no. You have to ask the deacons. People would like to have the streamline. Let's just ask the pastor if he's okay with it. Then it's a blessing. Now, maybe in a large staff-led church, that's a business manager question. I don't know, but at least on some level, I have to, wish that my brothers who don't have an ordained diaconate, who don't have a diaconate, I guess I should say, to be clear, they don't have a diaconate, they're missing out on the blessing of saying, you got to ask the deacons, because they're officers with us, right? When we ordain deacons, that's by the way how we get deacons. We ordain them. We give them the right hand of fellowship, and what is it we say? To share in this office, in this ministry, with us. So why do we not want to have deacons?
I don't know, and I don't understand it. I think that there's some feeling that it's a protest of some sort for some, that we shouldn't do this until it can be done rightly.
Yeah.
And I just that's not a good way to lead a church, to not do things because they're not being done fully to the way you expect them to be. You can't dismiss it. Worship is not done perfectly. I mean, I guarantee you that we all think our churches are probably, on the whole, doing worship right, in the sense of being in accordance with biblical principles. But I bet you someone could walk in and point something out that we might want to rethink. Does that mean we have to stop worship and not do these things, or change, or not? No, we're not going to have singing until we get the singing right. No, you do what God's told us to do, and we work through the proper channels of the church and the things He's given to us to see that we get these things done rightly. If we think they're wrong, so no, I think a lot of it was protest in some way.
Yeah, let me play a quick video from this last year dealing with that very issue, that there are guys who think that women should be ordained to the office of deacon, and so they just don't ordain any deacons. And see what you think here.
Thank you. T.E. Aaron Baker, Chicago Metro Presbytery. I'm rising to speak against this amendment to BCO 7.3.
Yes, sir.
Our session believes, at the church where I serve, our session...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, especially when I eat your time, but if I could trouble you to come a little bit closer to the microphone. Thank you, sir.
The session at the church where I serve believes that women should be permitted to serve in the office of deacon, and that qualified women should be ordained to that office. We hold that position for theological and exegetical reasons. If anyone is curious how someone, particularly a Presbyterian, could come to that position, you could read Ed Clowney's book from 1995, The Church. You could read the Minority Report of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church's report of the Committee on Women in Church Office that was adopted in 1988. Or Robert Strimple's paper, also from 1988, called Phoebe Was a Deacon, Other Women Should Be Too. But I'm not arguing for that position, nor am I suggesting that other sessions should do that. We know that we may not ordain women to the office of deacon, and so we have always desired to honor our denomination and to honor our commitment to the vows that we have made to the denomination. And so for the last 17 years, we have not ordained anyone to the office of deacon. After training and examination, we have commissioned men and women together and asked them to serve equally as deacons. This is not ideal for us, and I'm very aware that it's not ideal for many of you. Again, I'm not arguing that any other session do this. I'm just telling you what our session has done in the open with knowledge of our presbytery for 17 years. There are many other churches in our denomination, as we have heard, who do what we do or something similar to it in order to hold together those two things, our biblical convictions and our desires to submit to the denomination. So I'm speaking for my own church as well as for others when I ask you all to vote this down for the sake of charity. And I mean that in the sense of forbearance and love and kindness, specifically for the sessions that will be put into very difficult positions and have to make hard choices if this amendment passes. If we are forced into a position where we have to make these kind of decisions, it will not be because our practice has shifted or changed. And I think that's very important for me to say, and also I hope very important for everyone to hear. We won't have changed anything. It will be because our denomination has changed and shifted and left us behind.
Well, there's exactly that perspective that you were articulating, Job, that we believe women should be ordained, and so we're not going to ordain anybody until they can be ordained too. It's kind of, if it almost seems like, sometimes I'll do with my children that way. Well, if you can't agree on what to watch, nobody's going to watch TV, or we're going to watch what I want to watch. But why not just, there are denominations where women can be ordained to the diaconate, right? There's the ARP, the RPCNA.
Denominations that we are in full fraternal relations with.
Faithful denominations, right? I'm not saying go to the PCUSA or the ECHO. Faithful, Reformed, mostly complementarian. denominations. So on the website of their bulletin, their order of worship for this week, they list their diaconate, and along with the session there. So I don't know what to make of those names and what that means, but it's hard to audit how much some of these churches are coming into conformity. I'm thankful that there seems to be an awareness that this would mean that they have to bring their practice in conformity with the Constitution. And Job, I think one of the arguments that has been made or was made about that change was that this isn't actually changing anything in our Constitution as far as what's required. It's simply clarifying what's already there, that officers are to be inducted by ordination, that you can't have unordained officers.
Well, is there any such thing as an unordained officer, according to the PCA or how we understand the scriptures?
Right.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think the Dutch have emphasized that there is the general office of all believer.
Well, yes,
but if everybody's an officer, then the word doesn't mean anything, right?
Right. I think in the sense we're talking about, like these, I guess I didn't honestly follow the argument that Teaching Elder Baker, I think that was his name, was making. I didn't follow it of the church has left us behind, the church has changed. Like, well, but sometimes you need to. This is okay to improve. And I guess I go back to it saying no one ever said you couldn't ordain deacons, and there was even provisions for diaconal assistants. I simply don't understand we either ordain women or we ordain no one. I don't follow that, and I find that to not be charitable when we were asked to be charitable. So we either, it's like, well, I looked at it saying, well, I'm not, again, I think I'm a lot of people. I'm not suggesting I do think you're wrong to think that women can be ordained as deacons, but that's not the point. I'm not even asking you to change your view. We're asking you to come into conformity to how we've agreed to practice. And at a charity, I think it's charitable to say, I don't even feel like having the conversation about the view, because that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to get things in line with how we're supposed to be and how we've agreed to in our practice. And yet we're being asked to be kind and to let them continue to not do that. And to let them say, no, we're not going to do what we're supposed to. And actually, in another way, it is saying, according to right, you quoted it earlier, I think it was Matt actually, if there is no diaconate, it falls in the session. We either ordain women or the session will do all the work. Is that not the argument here? And I just find this not to be charitable or helpful.
And that seems to, the apostles were very clear, the elders there in Acts 6, and I speak of the same group, apostles and elders, at that point in church history, that this is not something that we can have added to our plate, that we have enough to do in the ministry of the word and prayer, that we literally have no bandwidth for this, as we might say today. So there again, charity, what's more loving, to put more things on the elders, to take away from the ministry of the word, prayer for the people of God, or to ordain the men and appoint women assistants and men assistants? I don't know what you call a male diaconal assistant. Do you know, Dr. Lee?
It's still an assistant to the deacons.
Do we call them deacons, though? Are the male assistants deaconesses?
I don't call anyone deaconesses. I call them deacons assistants. So
assistant to the deacon.
Yeah, assistants to the deacons.
Assistants to the deacons. So,
but in deacon training, like one of the main things we spend time on is telling the men, your wife is going to be needed to you, and other women in the church are going to be needed, because if you start listing out the things that are probably necessary for the deacons to at least make sure are being cared for or could potentially come up, you see why in wisdom that provision was made to potentially appoint people for that. And a lot of the time is saying now, so when women in the church, when we have discussions or hear about it, say, what's the role of women here? It is a good reminder, at least the deacon say, you have a good answer to that question. To say, ladies, we have a lot of things that you can do that are not simply household management type stuff in terms of, cleaning and nursery and such. We have actual ministry. There are things that women would be helpful with. And I'm not going to get into all that, but that's what I try to help the deacons understand is you help answer that question. You're probably at the forefront of answering that question of how women can serve in the church beyond the things that we tend to associate them with doing.
Indeed. I was having lunch with one of our... Oh, go ahead.
The language of Acts, when deacons were, first introduced, is that it is not good for the elders to be taken away. So that arrangement, we're explicitly told, is not good for the elders to be taken away from the ministry of the word. And so, conversely, we can infer that the office of deacon is a very good one. As we've been saying all along, it's a blessing. It's a gift that Christ has given to the church, and we should be grateful for it. And the way in which we understand that, again, there are other fellowships that we are in close communion with. The way that we understand that in our fellowship is that in Scripture we see evidence that it is only to men that Christ calls and ordains men to serve as deacons. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this overture this change didn't only deal with deacons. We still have a woman pastor in the PCA, at least one. I don't, I haven't done an audit of every church, but what is lost when we refer to unordained, I assume unordained people as pastors? Because of course there is, as we alluded to earlier, there's a sense in which all Christians minister to one another. Might even be said to pastor, or at least pester one another. But what is lost when we take the title, as this section of our Constitution deals with, and give titles to unordained people? I mean, you can go online and you can become a German baron or a Bavarian duke or whatever for, you pay $25 and you buy a treat. And so that certainly does something to those actual hereditary titles. What about these spiritual ecclesiastical titles when they're given to people who aren't ordained and aren't called by God to that particular office?
I would say clarity. If we start to be lax about things that I think are clear in our polity, then I think we start to have some confusion introduced about other matters as well. I think this is historically in the PCA an issue that was very important. And you guys probably know better than I do, but I think it's an issue that was important enough that contributed to the impetus for forming a new denomination, right? That when these men came out of the PCUS generally and formed the PCA, they borrowed, or they took the same Book of Church Order, but they made great efforts to change a lot of the language with respect to officers from men, or I'm sorry, excuse me, from person, the person being examined, the person being called to this office, and to update that language to say that man being examined or that man who was called to this office. I think you see that kind of language change in several of the places. So I think you lose a lot of clarity and a lot of the historical context for why we made this change in the first place.
Yeah, that these issues are not small. These are creation level issues, right? This isn't just a cultural matter. That Paul, when he's instructing Timothy on how to bring order to the church at Ephesus, appeals to Adam being formed first. Now, we don't know why. I mean, there are many areas in which my wife is more astute than I am. Many areas in which women are exceptionally gifted. I was having lunch the other day with one of our young adults who's about to move away, I think has moved away, and I said to him, when I think we were discussing some scandal in a church about the way a man was pastoring shepherding women and counseling them one-on-one. And I said, look, if anyone wants to be counseled by me, I said, well, we're going to do it in the office. We're going to do it with the door open. Or I said, I said to him, or I tell him, just go talk to this guy's mother, because she's a wise woman. She understands the Bible. She's a godly woman. But she would never want to be called pastor, nor would she describe the ministry that she has to the church as pastoring, because there's a special calling and way of doing that ministry of shepherding that a pastor does. I wonder.
Yeah, it really does. It hits at whether it's a woman or not. It really starts to mess with our teaching that the call to the office of pastor is the office, but in this case we're talking about pastor, is both an internal and an external call. An internal call has the internal sense of being called to being a pastor, and so if someone is called to that, it is a work of God. And he is done through the Spirit, is convicting and bringing them to that. So it begs the question, did God call this person to be a pastor? It then puts that upon the church in some sense. And then there's an external side, is where the church would agree and assent to what has happened within and would make the call. But if someone in the PCA has the title of pastor, and we know if it's a woman, they were not ordained and called because the presbytery had no involvement, you've just changed the nature of the external call and how we're going about it and how we believe the Bible has us go about it. And you've actually, if it's in particular case, if it's a woman, you're calling into question how we understand the internal call. And what is that? What takes that? Because if we believe the scripture teaches women cannot be pastors, they are not going to have an internal call to ministry. And so now we're bringing that discussion up potentially. And then the external, and it throws off everything, saying how we determine the internal and external in this particular congregation or this particular session is how we're going to do things. That may be how you want to do things, but that is not how we do things in the PCA. And this needs to be brought forward. And because you say, well, what does it matter to you? It's like, well, we are one body, and we should have clarity on some things that everybody needs to universally agree to. I would ask the question, do you think the internal and the external call are something we should all be on the same page on?
I also think in a particular cultural moment, I don't mean within the church, although I think it kind of extends into the church a little bit. There's this obsession with titles, right? In our vocation, you see, someone could be the assistant vice president of such and such department of whatever corporation they lead or whatnot. And titles aren't totally unimportant, but I think we've made much ado about them in terms of saying, now when we bring that kind of logic into the church, a person does not have dignity unless they're given a title. I don't think I'm the right person to steelman this argument, but what I've heard from some folks who would articulate why they want women to be referred to as deaconesses is that they feel that it somehow dignifies the kind of service that they render unto the church. And I think we make much ado about titles because I think in some sense we feel that it conveys a sense of dignity or honor upon a person, and so. In general, I'm a little bit loath to make a lot of titles. I've joked on here and elsewhere that my favorite title that I've ever held is nursery coordinator at CCPC, which I do with great joy, coordinating that nursery. But
you're doing
when it comes to
job at it.
Thanks. When it comes to titles that offices, things that Christ has named as offices in the church, we should be very particular about those things. And here you've got BCO 7.3 up. The language of usurpation that's being used, I think, again, there's a strong historical connection with, in particular, the Protestant Reformation and the distinction of Presbyterianism from other forms of polity, in particular Catholicism, where I think we could point to a lot of examples to say that, in particular, the Pope has usurped a lot of titles that are beyond what a person in the church should claim for himself. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, adored by all the earth, such and such. Yeah, I don't have the full adoration of the Pope memorized by any stretch of the imagination. But
so you weren't exaggerating there?
No, when the Pope is installed, when a new Pope is installed, the adoration of the Pope involves the other bishops heaping those kinds of titles and that kind of praise upon the Pope. So I don't mean to say by any stretch of the imagination that this deaconess issue is anything like that or anything like we're not in danger of changing polity altogether to become Catholic, but I do stress that to say there is a weightiness to a theological weightiness to the question of titles, particularly when we are considering the titles of officers in the church. So again, the question as to why we are so particular about this, it's not for the sake of being mean or exclusive or somehow overly scrupulous about an unimportant matter. I think we're dealing with, again, the gifts that Christ has given the church. We're dealing with historically how there have been people to usurp titles and honors that Christ nowhere gives to any man in the church, and we need to be cautious about how we use titles, particularly when they are connected with ecclesial offices.
Jesus warns, even in his own day, of the culture around the church that loves titles, loves recognition, right? Luke 22, 25. The kings and Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. And so even these titles are not so much titles of honor. Even though there is honor to the deacon, honor to the elder, honor to the pastor, they're not so much honorifics as just functionaries, right? Similar to a medical doctor or a vet. They have in a way a spiritual specialty, don't they? And we want to distinguish that aspect of his person, that he has a spiritual expertise. I wonder if this use of the word pastor and its proliferation, not just with women as we've seen, but all sorts of, is perhaps a result of us separating or divorcing the ministry of the word from the work of an elder. That we have so many pastors who don't preach or who rarely preach. That used to be, at least in Mississippi, maybe, Job, you can back me up on this, but in Mississippi, they don't generally call you pastor, they call you preacher.
Or brother.
Because that's what a pastor does. Or brother, yeah.
But I see the connected point you're making. Yeah, you're a preacher. Yeah,
that a pastor's a preacher. Whereas now in this professionalization of ministry, that pastor has been disconnected maybe from the preaching of the word in many cases. What do y'all think? Maybe I'm way off base there. It's a snow day after all.
I think so. I mean, seeing that there's a lot of things go on and titles getting used loosely does remind me of my old evangelical days. There's a lot of guys that were pastors and claimed the title of pastor. And in some sense, the church may have made them a pastor, but it was a very interesting definition. Pastor of media. Again, I don't know. I was about to say I'm not anti-media, but I kind of am. But that's a different discussion.
Maybe you should do a podcast on that.
Yeah, maybe so. But I guess what I'm saying is it wasn't until it became Presbyterian or was digging into Presbyterian understanding of offices in the church that it became clear to me that so the title reflects what the person does, what the office is about, and so those things can be done but do they need a title? I do think that some of it feels odd because maybe you have to hire someone in the church and pay them to do it. So it's like, we're paying so-and-so to do this. And maybe it feels easier to justify it if you title it a different way or give it a title of nature. I'm not making puny motives on that, but maybe some process it that way is what I'm saying. I don't know, but I don't think it's helpful because, again, it just dilutes what this office is meant to be and what the Lord intends to be done through the men who fill that office.
Yeah, Ryan, I think there's some of that, in terms of what you're saying about the understanding of what a pastor is and what a pastor does, a preacher or brother or father in some contexts. I think, and I think we also see some of that in terms of the rise of the corporate model of church polity and the proliferation of things like executive pastors. But I think the more pressing issue here is peace and unity within the church. There are specific designations that we give to particular teaching elders within the PCA. I'm thinking of like an evangelist in particular, and in some sense, that's just it's just verbiage. It's just how we've chosen to label a particular teaching elder in a particular context who has the authority to ordain officers without bringing together a session or presbyters from other churches or something like that. In the OPC, one of the designations that they have for teaching elder is the office of a teacher. That's an example of a teaching elder, and they stress that this particular pastor, if you will, is someone who teaches within our church as opposed to councils and things like that. And so there's some sense of like word game-ness about, why do we call some people pastors, or when we could call them preachers or evangelists or teachers or what have you. But I think the more pressing issue is the spirit of preserving peace and unity within the church, to say we're trying to say that this is something that we do not do within the PCA, right? We do not have the office of a deaconess. We do not have the office of a female pastor. That's a distinctive about what the PCA is in terms of how we are organized and how we relate to one another. And for the sake of peace within the church, we should try to honor that, and we should try to honor each other as we go about that.
Yeah, very well said there, Dr. Lee. That's why you're a doctor.
A title I don't care much for, as we talk about titles.
Because you can diagnose the issue, right? See what I did there? A couple other smaller issues that I think reflect the PCA as, turned a corner or is in a much more sound, more committed, more precise area than she was 7 years ago. And part of that is, I think, having to fight, debate, discuss, react, and respond and correct, dealing with remorse. We've had to sharpen other areas, but there are still folks who want to admit atheists into church courts, and twice the assembly has voted that down. And, we've only got 6 overtures up there, and I don't see one to try to do that a third time. So I wonder if that reflects a greater concern for peace amongst the brethren who want to admit atheists to the church courts, that they're gonna give it a rest and see what happens. What do y'all think about that? Do you think it may come up? Do you think it'll be wise to wait a few years?
Well, January and February are busy season for presbyteries meeting, right? So we may see coming out of February some more overtures that try to do this, but I think it was pretty soundly defeated last year at General Assembly, so that seems to suggest that it felt different than the sexuality overtures being defeated the first go around.
Right, because those passed at the GA level, and then
that's
the reason they failed was presbytery, and they still got a majority of the presbyteries.
Yeah.
But this was a failed overture, failed General Assembly, came back the next year, failed overtures twice. I think George Sayor, who I would have loved to have discuss this, but he's recovering from hernia surgery, so I'll just reference research that he's done. George Sayor counted the number of times. It's something like 6 times in the last 2 years that this particular question has been answered in the negative in the PCA.
Yeah, I think I'm remembering I think I'm remembering this correctly. This past year, I was on Overture's committee, and we voted against it, and it was brought back to us, and we voted against it again. And then there was a minority report, and the assembly voted against that. So that was 3 in 1 year.
Yeah. And then, so maybe it was just 5, but I was told there'd be no math. So that's again, the church is requiring precision. Oh, I hear the children coming in from the snow. You may hear that as well.
Sounds like
my or a cat. Yeah, my daughter, the moment she got up, my 2-year-old, I want play in snow. And there's only like 2 inches. You can still see the blades of grass, and I know from all my time in this mythical place called Ohio, which some people don't believe exists, but that if you can see the blades of grass, you're just gonna get muddy out there. It's not gonna be fun. So I told them all to wait, but their mother took them out because she's a better parent than I am. But they're back in now. So we've rejected that, and we've done something that I think is unprecedented in the PCA on a number of counts. There was a personal resolution that came up from an individual teaching elder to investigate is not the right verb, but to ask 2 of our agencies for a report on their relationship to a theologically errant book, so-called Jesus Calling. And the assembly voted to ask for information on that. We're not, I don't think the assembly commented on the book itself, which is clearly not, the book itself is clearly not in keeping with a biblical view of inspiration, of prayer. It's deeply, deeply problematic. But I don't think the assembly commented on that so much as just wanted to know from MTW what counsel was given to the author, and then from our bookstore, our Discipleship Ministries, to ask, what's your relationship with it? Because Dr. Lee, I see you nodding your head, so you may remember better than I, but it sounds, I seem to recall the bookstore sold or had it on the shelf as far as you could buy it, you could add it to your cart, but then removed it from publication or from sale after that.
That's how I remember it.
Okay, thank you, Job. Somebody back me up here. My production team has not provided adequate notes for this segment, so that's curious. Why did you list it for sale and then pull it from sale? It's by a PCA missionary, wife of a teaching elder. So that seems to suggest the assembly is interested in theology, in doctrine, much more so than she was even 5 or 7 years ago. What do y'all think?
I think it shows yes, it does show that, but it also shows something else. It sort of ties it together. I wasn't here for I've not been around most of the existence of the PCA, but when the floor debate was going on and the conversations that you might have heard about at General Assembly about this issue, the Jesus Calling investigation or report, it was very little of it was defending the content of the book, which is to say that we weren't really arguing over, is this book something we should produce? We wanted to know what happened, and some didn't want to know. They didn't think it was necessary, but that wasn't because they thought it was. In most cases, it wasn't because people were happy with the content. I don't know what if that would have ever been something in the PCA, but it seemed that, again, across the board, there was real unity on, nobody wants to promote this book. Hardly anybody wants this book out there. We just maybe had some disagreement, but mostly people wanted to know what happened and why. That's a good thing. And it seems that, would that have happened in 2017? Would the book have been sort of assumed? You guys tell me if you disagree with my assumption, my saying there's an assumption, almost assumed to be, well, yeah, the book's not great. But do we need to do anything about it is the real question. I think that's a good thing, but was it always like that? I don't know.
Outside of the church and my civil vocation, I'm doing some research right now on, it was a survey that was fielded among private Christian school families, particularly looking at what sort of family worship or family devotions practices they have, if any. And one of the things that I was struck by as we were conducting that research was that it was the mothers more so than the fathers who talked about the important role that devotional material played in their personal and family devotional life. Fathers seem to stress the Bible more so than women, and mothers seem to stress the devotional materials more so. And so I was struck by the floor speeches at General Assembly about this Jesus Calling book, because it seemed that some of the men who were standing to defend it, and I'm painting with a broad brush here, but they seem to be coming from a persuasion that generally argued in favor of more representation, more involvement of women in church polity. And they were the ones commonly articulating an argument along the lines of, like, I've never used this book myself, so why are we concerned with it? And it struck me as odd because we should be concerned with it, not necessarily because the men in that assembly are the ones who are frequenting a book like this, but we should be concerned with this because likely there are people in our congregations, and maybe even more likely women in our congregations, more so than men in our congregations, who have probably read a book like this. I think one of the speeches, the 3-second speech, maybe a 5-second speech, talking about how one gentleman, I think he was a teaching elder, who said that, look, my mother used this for years and it just destroyed her Bible reading life. She started
ruling elder
reading
Doug
these
Sharp,
books.
man of the hour.
Yeah, that's right. Ruling elder. And he said, my mother started reading this and she stopped reading her Bible. This, basically replaced all of her Bible reading in her life. So, I think it is something worth, at the very least, as this overture has done, investigating what exactly is the PCA's relationship with this book, and figuring this out. I think more broadly, there's a bigger issue kind of at play here than Jesus Calling. Jesus Calling, I think, by virtue of the number of copies it has sold, obviously very influential and very worth clarifying at least what the PCA's relationship with it is. But even more broadly than that, I think the bigger issue is, for example, there's literature that's sold on the PCA bookstore website. There's literature sold by the PCA bookstore at General Assembly that may be theologically questionable content, certainly features things like Second Commandment violations. And I think we do need to be concerned with the literature that we're producing as a denomination and selling and even profiting from. So there's a larger issue to be concerned about.
That's a very important point, Dr. Lee. The pastoral role, the pastoral concern in bookstores, in things you make available. I remember when I was at First Pres Jackson, I asked, we had a very good bookstore at First Pres Jackson, as you would expect at a church that size, and I asked the bookstore librarian manager, do you sell such and such book, which was good. It had some problems, but on the whole, it was helpful. I don't even remember what the book was called. His name was the librarian's name was Doug. I forget his surname. He's gone on to his eternal reward now, I think. But Doug said, "Ryan, we don't carry that. I know it's got some great aspects of it, but and the reason we don't sell it is the number one rule at the bookstore here is don't confuse the sheep." And I think, as a church bookstore, whether it's at the session level or the General Assembly level, that's a good rule. Don't confuse the sheep. We shouldn't, if people want to get the Jesus Storybook Bible, they can get it from Amazon. They don't need to get it from the church bookstore. And I don't know, if church bookstores are selling that or what, but we don't need to be, as you say, encouraging people to think that Second Commandment violations are within keeping of our constitutional standards, or helpful for that matter.
Agreed.
Well, there's one other topic I wanted to bring up, and it's based on something you raised last night, Job, on the Presbycast. We do every year. We get some political statements that the people want the General Assembly to make, to do, or to study. And this year, it's probably going to be about Christian nationalism. I don't know what Christian nationalism is. I think it is whatever someone who claims to be a Christian and votes differently than I do. That is Christian nationalism. Last year we had, I don't know if we were to reaffirm our statements about mutilating children. And then the year before that, we impaneled a commission to petition the civil magistrate to stop the mutilation of children. And then the year before that, we had two political questions. One was about violence, and it seemed like more, virtue signaling, responding to the events of January 6th. And the other dealt with the murder of unborn children. And the latter passed, the former did not. So the PCA seems, over the last several years, to be much, on the one hand, willing, maybe more so than in years past, but willing to speak to issues of civil concern, but also very discerning when she does. And so, Joe, would you talk about that the moral and ethical emphasis or interest of the assembly?
Yeah, I was making the point that I think this is kind of where we are. What you'll continue to see is that you're going to see less discussions. Think about the last few years: blog posts, Twitter threads, Substacks, podcasts, all of which you do, Ryan. You do all these things.
I'm the problem.
Yes, that's true.
What is wrong with the PCA? Dear sir, I am.
Yes. You would see it. This would come up a lot. Sermon series, Bible studies and different things about political understanding, political views, and things that were not unimportant, but they seemed to be inherently political because of the timing of things. And so it seems to me that discussion about the church's response to this social issue, the church's thoughts, the Christian response to that political thing, I think that's going to start lessening. I think it already has, but I think it's going to lessen as we continue to move forward, because it seems that there's a variety of reasons that I don't know if that's particularly pertinent to say why, but it seems that's going to lessen. But what I do think is going to happen is that the questions are going to come up. That will mean two things: that churchly matters will be discussed more amongst things in the PCA, worship, officers, whatever, churchly matters, things that are ecclesial. Whereas the things that we talk about that are from happening in the world, we'll probably see more discussions on moral and ethical things. That's going to come up. So my take, and now the counterpoint is that we have 6 overtures and 2 of them are on Christian nationalism. And my opinion is, again, I'm simply speculating in regards to what I'm about to say, but I don't think they're going to go anywhere. I think that by June, the energy for that is going to be fairly low. And it just seems that people, for my sense, are not that the political discussions in the church are going to go down, because a lot of things culturally have been settled for better or for worse, or at least settled for the time, or there's peace there. People are not as engaged in a lot of matters of what was the division because we solved some of it, but there's still outstanding things out there. And if you start talking to people about what they're thinking through in the PCA, it's people talking about others having conversations about Christian nationalism, not so much in their immediate circles, or at least it's just a topic of conversation. I just don't think it's going to go anywhere. I think the Overtures Committee will vote to send it back or not move forward with it. But I think it's going to lessen because some things have been settled in culture and other matters start to take precedent. Or I could be totally wrong and not a whole lot comes up because it's sort of a peacetime, so to say, and there's only a few overtures to deal with. But I think whatever we do talk about will be more ecclesial.
This is, the church's relationship with the state. This is the topic I feel like I don't know all that well. I think in a lot of ways it's beyond me. And so, take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt. I recently had the chance to hear Alan Strange speak. Alan Strange is an OPC minister and also a professor at Mars, not the Red Planet, the Reformed Seminary in Indiana. And he recently wrote a book called Empowered Witness. I've just started it and I've enjoyed it so far. I think it's taken something that I found to be a complex and challenging topic, and he's made it very accessible. From my perspective, it feels like the Two Kingdom and the One Kingdom guys are kind of talking past each other. I think they have more in common than the debate would make it seem. But I think I was in favor of some of the overtures that you mentioned. I voted in favor of the PCA statement on abortion, and I wasn't at the General Assembly two GAs ago now with the statement on transgender mutilation surgeries. I can't remember the lingo exactly. I think the church does have a right to speak to those issues. And I think there are a lot of political issues that the church has the right to speak about, in particular because the trend in politics has been greater and greater denial of natural law. But I think, and Dr. Strange's book has been very clarifying for me on this, I think the church, when speaking on those issues, should resort itself to only appealing to scripture and theological doctrinal arguments. The church can't speak on the issue of abortion. The church can't speak on the issue of transgenderism by merely appealing to scripture and to doctrine. It doesn't have to go beyond its bounds and also appeal to scientific evidence and numbers from outside of the church and things like that. So I think, again, based on the broader trend that I see, that that there is so much denial of natural law in society, broadly speaking, that there are going to be important opportunities for the church to speak into those issues. And I think in sticking to its ordained means, the church should speak into those issues by appealing to scripture and to doctrine. Now, that being said, on the Christian nationalism issue, I think, like you, Ryan, like you said, I don't know what Christian nationalism is. It just seems to be the thing that you don't like that the other side is doing politically by also appealing to Christianity, I guess. Whoever wields that term seems to kind of make similar arguments along those lines. The things that I don't like, in terms of what I just said about sticking to its ordained means, I don't know how the church can speak to the issue of Christian nationalism by merely appealing to scripture and doctrine in the same way that it could about the abortion issue or about the transgender issue. In particular, because there's not a clear agreed upon definition of what Christian nationalism is, right? If that existed, then perhaps we could take the next step of saying, okay, what does scripture say about this very defined thing that we now agree upon? But the two overtures that are up right now on the PCA website that try to deal with the Christian nationalism issue are not clear and definite, right? They list a few things that perhaps an ad hoc committee could study, or what is it? An ad interim study committee could examine with respect to Christian nationalism. But both overtures actually leave the issue wide open in saying, or other things that the committee deems relevant to study as well. And I think before we can do that, we need to first agree upon what it is that we're going to study. Because without agreeing upon what it is that we're going to study, we can't actually do so from the area of the church's competence, which is, again, scripture and doctrine.
That's a very dangerous mandate to give to a committee, or basically anything else that you want to study.
Yeah.
With some implications there.
Yeah, and very pragmatically speaking, that will be one reason why I think that it will go nowhere, because there's going to be people saying, I have no interest in doing that. It's too open, it's too loose, it's too undefined. It's going to be a miserable process. I don't think, and I guess it comes back to, because the lack of definition is an evidence that this thing is not really going anywhere. It's just a lot of conversations and talks about things that are, I just think people, it's interesting conversation to an extent, But I just don't think that the body is going to want to talk about it. And if you start laying that out that that's what's got to be done, Matt, I think you'll find quickly like, yeah, I'd like to focus on the ecclesial if you don't mind. Because people will say this is not something that's pressing. It needs to be explained why it's so pressing. What is the problem? What is the harm that's being done? And what do you want to see stopped? And help us understand why a study committee for that would be a helpful thing. I am personally, maybe I'll go on the record and say, the idea of the PCA putting out a paper and trying to define what Christian nationalism is sounds like one of the worst ideas I've ever heard. That sounds horrendous to think that we would put out the second book, so to say, on Christian nationalism. Oh boy, let's don't go there.
Plus, Ryan already had Miles Smith on the podcast, so
third book,
$20,000.
So we have Miles Smith, we have Stephen Wolf, and the PCA position paper. This. Please don't do this.
Well, and I think you've given us a good razor. We'll call it Job's razor. How is this churchly? And I think, if we would apply that razor to overtures, we could cut down on the work that we have to do. Well, anything else that y'all want to talk about as far as looking back, looking forward, where, contextualizing the PCA right now? Where is she?
It's an era of ordinary. It's good. Ordinary people seem to be more involved, more place of leadership, helping steer conversations, thoughts. I love that. Regular, ordinary guys. It's not saying anything about anybody else. Just I noticed that there's not just a few names doing things. There's a lot, and that's very good. I think it's good that you're seeing a little more procedural things coming into play and being fixed. Sometimes to clean your house, you have to make it look worse. And sometimes, it is like, we're going to clean all it out, and you get done and say, I thought we were cleaning. But, you do see some things, but you've noticed over the years, like, okay, we've got some things that need to be fixed, but I think it's starting to. And I think, so you're seeing that. You're seeing ordinary and some guys with some real skills and of understanding how we can get some things done better in process and procedure that are necessary. Very few people love process and procedure. It's just kind of not very exciting, but you have to have it. And I think it's been very helpful. Polity does matter. And so I think that you're seeing those kind of things happen, and they're being done by a lot of regular, everyday pastors. And I think that's very encouraging.
Was it you last night or somebody else who talked about the mediocre men, the normal pastors are stepping up to do?
That was me. I raised the point. Yeah. You'll see that continue on. Again, there was an era probably of, a great men great men doing great things. Maybe we're in the era of good dudes doing good stuff. Just regular guys, right? And that's good. You need leaders, you need people to help in that way, but you have to have regular people doing things. And I think that, especially in a Presbyterian denomination, it seems to be one of the things that has helped most. So I think you'll continue to see those guys lead us well, help us, guide us. Ryan, you're an example of that. Dr. Lee's an example of that, of regular, ordinary, normal people doing good stuff that's helpful to the denomination. And I'm excited about that. I think that's what's in it. That's where the energy is, and people are responding to it well.
Yeah.
I think the big issue facing the PCA, we didn't spend much time talking about it, so I guess we could spend the next hour and a half talking about it, is what the PCA thinks about worship, right? I think some of the things that we talked about are kind of tangentially related to worship in terms of like the officers or even the atheist issue, right? What is the purpose of church courts if it's not worship? Is tangentially related to worship. But we have an overture up, and there was an overture that was debated and voted down on the floor of General Assembly last year seeking to make parts of the Directory of Worship constitutional. So I think having now moved on from the revoice controversy as far as big General Assembly debates go, I think the next big debate that's going to take the next 3 to 5 years is worship. What do we agree upon with respect to what worship looks like in the PCA? What's fundamentally important? Where do we see room for liberty and things like that? So I think that's going to be the next big thing.
I agree. That was part of what I had in mind when I said churchly matters will become more prominent. Yeah.
Well, brothers, thank you for your time and the insights that you've shared. Always a privilege for me and an encouragement to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for the invite, Ryan.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah. And now let's smile for the camera so that I can have something for the thumbnail. All right, there we go. Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard. You just heard from Ruling Elder Matt Lee and Teaching Elder Job Dalomba as we discussed the prospects and perspective on the PCA right now at the beginning of 2025. The Westminster Standard is the podcast of Jude 3 and the PCA. For more information or to support us, you can visit our website, jude3pca.org. Join us again next week. I'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.